All right, before we get into Chapter 6, let's talk about the homework pages that I just passed out. There's a front and a back to it. All right. Now, Chapter 5, the homework that's on there, let me just bring that up, says inside of your Chapter 5 homework folder, create an HTML page called contactme.html. Then you'll add a wrapper and you'll add a bunch of CSS. All right. You'll make sure you've got a header, a nav, a main, and footer sections. You can put anything in here you want. I will show you a site. You may care about this, you may not care. And either way, it's okay. But there's kind of a neat site. I think I've shown you this before, that you can go out to lipsum.org. So literally, if I wanted to put 13 garbage paragraphs on my page, I could type 13 in there and boom, it'll give them to me. It's just filler text. All right, and that's just lipsum.org. It pushes you out to someplace else, but that's typically where people go. There's also one that's called, I think it's Pixum. All right. And what's kind of cool about this is if you use this one right here, it'll put a random image in for you, and every time you refresh, it'll change the image, which is kind of neat. I don't know, maybe you don't agree with that, but let's see, do I still have, I probably don't have that one up anymore. But on my Chapter 5 homework that I did, so you can see what the picture looks like, but notice every time I refresh, it changes. Again, that's not that cool of a thing, all right? And one of the things that you will learn when we get into the JavaScript portion of the class is, let's say you've got your own 10 different images on there, all right? You can set it up so that they go in a random order, or that every time you bring the site up, a different one of them would appear. All right, so we'll talk about stuff like that as we go on in here. But hopefully at least you find the instructions for this pretty easy to understand. This social media icons, these image links, kind of neat. I'm glad he put that in there, because if you Google that, one of the things that it'll bring up is what's something that's called Font Awesome, which you may or may not have heard of before. But if you include Font Awesome onto your web page, you literally have 5,000 or 10,000 different, I don't know if you call them glyphicons or glyph icons, the little icons. You've all seen those on a web page, where on the bottom it might have the Facebook icon, an Instagram icon, etc. So that'll be your first thing into that. All right. It says use the reset selector on the page. You can either use the reset selector like they showed in the book, or you can use normalize, or you can go out and Google Eric Meyer's reset.css, but have some kind of a reset on there. Notice you're going to add a border. It'll be of type inset. It'll be 10 pixels. You pick the color. You'll add a gradient. How did I know how to do that? I just showed you that. It was the sites on W3 Schools that I just showed you. And it'll have to be validated. So the HTML will have to be validated, and so will the CSS. I didn't check Evan's addition, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45, 50, 55, 60, 65, 70, 75, 80, 85, 90, 95, 100. So it's worth 100 points. Now, one thing I was, and again, I'm not asking for kudos for this. One of the differences between Evan and myself, and Evan's my counterpart teaching this class in St. Louis, he wants me to be more like him. And what I mean is, when you've got a test problem that's worth 5 points, you either get a 5 or you get a 0. That's how he does everything. So if you've got 6 things to do and you do 5 3/4 of them perfectly, and you leave off that last quarter, you get a 0. I don't do that. But he is doing what he can to twist my arm into trying to make me do that. And his rationale basically is, if you're doing this for a living, you know, years ago I had a student who came up on a Monday. I remember Jeff Davenport, nice guy, very different, but nice guy. He came up to me on a Monday and he said, "You ruined my weekend." I had no idea how, so I did ask. And he said, "Well, all weekend I can't fix this one error on this effing," which I didn't want him to say in front of class, or say period for that matter, C program. And he had an error. I knew immediately as soon as he showed me his code what the error was, but I wasn't going to tell him because of his attitude. And he said, "Well, I think I should get 100% for this." I said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, I worked on it really hard and it works right 90% of the time." And I said, "Well, then why don't you take it, why don't you mark it, and that can be your software, or that can be your slogan rather. It works 90% of the time." And he goes, "No one would ever buy that." I said, "You just asked me to." Get it? It's not really meant to be a joke. But either it's right when you're doing something for someone, or it's not right. But my guess is, as we move on in this, I will become more and more strict on the grading. All right, because I believe that as you get more and more expertise, this should look better and better. When you do your, we haven't talked about these yet, but when you do your electronic portfolio, that'll be due at the end of the semester, I'm going to be as picky as a lot more than you'll probably believe. You know, you spell something wrong, you're losing points. I don't care, because it's you. It's my hope is that one or more of you will take that electronic portfolio, and during the summer of 2019, you'll be out pounding the pavement trying to get some kind of an internship. One of my students, Colin, did that last year, and he's now working full-time for the company. So it happens. All right, yes? Is that in Lake St. Louis? What's Colin's last name?
I forget. Blonde hair?
No. He's got dark.
I
He's got dark hair.
was going to say, because I worked with the Colin who just started.
No, this is Colin Fubner. But he does not have blonde hair.
I think, no,
That is it? Okay. But I mean, he came in here and we had a woman who came in and said, "Hey, I'm looking for somebody to do this." He's one of 3 people in the class who came in and interviewed with the lady. So stuff happens. All right. All right. So hopefully everything else that's in there just makes sense. For Chapter 6, which we're going to go over in just a minute, what's the first thing? Use CSS positioning. That's what Chapter 6 is about. Relative positioning, fixed positioning, absolute positioning, static positioning. We'll get on that in just a minute. All right? So use that to achieve the following layout. You can use any images that you want, but they all must be the same size, so it should look like this on the page. You should have 8 images. Each image should have an H1 or some kind of a tag underneath it, and underneath the tag, there should be some text. Okay, so that's the first one. Second, read this article from CSS Tricks, all about floats, and then code a web page, a single page of your choosing that looks like this. Now, ideally, this is going to be something that you're going to want to put out on your electronic portfolio. So I would not recommend putting lipsome text in here. You should probably want it to look decent, professional. But you'll notice, what do we have here? Looks like some margin to me. All right? And you've got a sidebar. That's an aside. You've got a footer. Notice the aside does not stretch down all the way to the bottom of the page. And you've got main content and you've got a header. This is more reminiscent of what many web pages today look like. Okay? The article is on here. All right, it's right there. And if you click on it, you know, I'm not going to print out hard copies. It's about 10 pages long. Okay? And you'll notice too, wow, Jeff, that's 9 years old. Yes, it is. But floating really has not changed. All right, floating hasn't. But I'm going to tell you what has changed, because it's not on this homework. But if you want to learn, because people don't like to use floats, they're a pain in the butt. So you say, well, now how do you get around it? There's now something available that's called Flexbox that you can use instead of using floating. And if you want to go in there and teach yourself Flexbox, and you want to use that rather than floats, I don't care. That's fine. They're both still used a lot in industry. And then finally, using the same web page developed in number 2 above, develop your site with header, footer, etc. This is a neat site. Best way to show you it is to show you it. And that is, notice if I come here, you say, well, what's so good about that? Well, notice I want to have 3 columns. I want there to be a gap between each of 25 pixels. And I want there to be a ruler between each one that's 3 pixels. It gives you the CSS. So basically all you have to do is plug that CSS into your CSS file. So it's not a lot that you have to do there. I think Evan put this one in because it's a cool site. I don't know. I didn't ask. All right. The other thing, remember, so those will be your homeworks, but also remember that we're working on this shape up thing. All right? So you were supposed to do the 3 and 4. Your homework is due by the end of the day today. Many people have sent it in already to me. If you haven't, get it to me by the end of the day so I can grade it. I'm trying to keep ahead on grading as opposed to getting behind. And then you will be doing 5. That'll be your lab for Chapter 5. And when you look here, not a lot. All right. And then 6. All right. Notice what we're doing. We're talking about a 3-column layout. And if that confuses you, you can always go back to that one site that I just showed you and look at that and start using that CSS. All right. Any questions on what your homework or labs are for chapters 5 and 6? I like to make them do a week after they've been assigned. What I'd like to do tomorrow, since we'll finish 6 before the period's over, or it'll be darn close at least. All right. What I'd like to do tomorrow is when you come in here, I will do a test review for the chapters we go over today. Okay? Then the rest of the period will be lab. Wednesday, just one written test, just chapter 5. And then lab. Thursday, chapter 6 written test. Make sense? All right. And then either Friday you're going to have a test or we're going to go on and do 7 and 8. All right. I'll let you know as soon as I know. Okay. All right. So with that, let's jump into chapter 6 here, which it looks like starts on page 201. How to use CSS for page layout. When we get to a later chapter in here, I don't know what chapter it is. I don't care. But we will talk about tables. It used to be people use tables for everything on a web page because it's really easy to center stuff in a table. So what people would do, and many web developers did this, I did this, is you'd have this huge table and you'd center everything in it and then you'd put other tables inside of it. That's how people basically did their formatting. But now with CSS, there's really no reason to do that. So this chapter, as you can see, talks about 2-column layouts, and it talks about 3-column layouts. So we've got 2 web pages that use a 2-column fixed width, how to use CSS to create text, and how to position. All right. So as we start taking a look in here, one thing to realize, I probably shouldn't have even had you do a lot of floats on your first one. Because let me ask you, you all did something like this, right? left, or this. Am I correct? Everybody did something like that? Okay. Well, I'm asking this question, and if you did, great. You don't even have to answer if you feel, I'm not going to answer that, then don't. But when you float to the left or you float to the right, by default, stuff is designed to keep floating to the left or floating to the right. So quite often, let's say that I'm on a page and I'm floating left. Now I want to start floating right. I shouldn't just have you do a float left and a float right. What you should do instead is you should be floating left, then put in like an empty div or something like that. All right? And typically that div will have an ID of something like clearfix. Like, what the heck is clearfix? All it says is clear both. That means if anything's being floated to the left, stop it. If anything's being floated to the right, stop it. Remove all floats. You don't have to call it clearfix, but quite often you'll see in there dot clearfix, curly brace, curly brace. Okay? Some people call it clear. That's not really advised, but clearfix is one that's often used. And if you say, well, I didn't do it, mine worked. Yeah, but if you put other stuff on a page, it might start getting screwed up. So, how to float and clear elements? Again, you might say, well, yeah, this isn't fair. You made us float and stuff, and we didn't even go over that. Yes, we did. And I did show you examples. And you did some work where you have floated before. All right? Here is an example when you look on here. Now notice what they've done. Okay? It says the CSS for the web page floating the sidebar. All right, what is that sidebar? Well, it's an aside. And notice how they floated it. The reason that some of this stuff starts being important is if you imagine that the width on your web page is 100%. And let's say that you want 5% here and 5% there. Everybody with me? So now you're talking about 90% that you've got on your page. All right? Well, you might decide that the stuff that's in here, that's going to take up 70%. All right? If I take 90 and subtract 70, that leaves me 20% for this. Does that make sense? And you might say, well, why is this down here? Because this is what we floated and where we floated it. This is outside of the floated area. That's why I'm telling you when you do your next test, all right, what I hate doing is saying, this is what it should look like when it gets done. Because you're not using your own creativity then. You're playing follow the leader. That's not the way it should be done. There's at least one of you in here, and probably several, that yours would look much better than mine will look. If for no other reason, I don't spend very much time when I write a key. All right, I spend a hell of a lot more time putting it up on the screen for you than I did actually writing it. So when you float an element to the left or right, the content that follows flows around it. I would strongly suggest reading this chapter. If you've gotten by so far and you really haven't read the chapter, I would. Remember that these are called paired pages. They give you a little summary down here of what's on the previous page. I'm concentrating on what's on the right. All right, I'm not trying to miss anything that's on the left, but I may occasionally. All right. Again, to stop the floating. Not only that, when I showed you that before with clear both, you don't have to clear both. You could say clear colon left, clear colon right, or clear colon both. Most people, when they clear, want to clear both, want to clear everything. But again, it depends. As it says in the example above, if you didn't use clear, it's as if the clear property hasn't been set before the footer that's down on the bottom, it will flow into the space beside the floated element. So in other words, probably it'll go down there without a clear fix. And again, I've mentioned this to you before. The easiest way to learn this stuff is to just sit there and start making some pages. All right. Now, next they talk about a 2-column fixed with layout. So notice, you often see things that look like this. I said this to you before, but if you look up on the screen, notice how the header and the footer take up virtually 100% of the content area. All right? The main and the aside do not. They're actually, that's typically the main will be wider than the aside. And you can have more than one aside. You could have an aside 1, then an aside 2 below it, and an aside 3 below that. All right? So what's nice about this example is, again, notice what they've done. Again, if you go through this stuff and you're like, I'm not really getting this, I start keying in the stuff that they have in here. All right? And only you know where you are in here right now. And I will tell you, I should have mentioned this before, if you didn't do that well on the test, in case you didn't know this, this is always the instructor's discretion. I drop your lowest test. All right? So if you didn't do well, then this will be the one that's dropped. Okay? People will say, well, what if I get zeros on 2 of them? Then you pick which one you want the 0 on. All right? I mean, it doesn't really matter. As it says here, in this case, in the example that they've shown, the main element is floated to the left, where the aside inside of it is floated to the right. It says then it doesn't matter whether the aside comes before or after the main element. If you wanted to prove that to yourself, you would take it in here and move it. And it should look the same. As it says, another alternative is to float both of them to the left. All right, so you'd say float left here and float left there, and you'd be like, wait a minute. Well, what that does is it moves this all over to the left, and then it says stay where you are. Well, there's no more left, so it puts it right there. But if you make one a float left and one a float right, the order in which you put these two doesn't matter. If you make that a float left and that a float left, the order matters. If you flipped it, then this one would be over here and that one would be over there. All right? So, it says instead of creating a fixed layout, you can create a fluid layout. That's typically what you're going to want today. And if you look at that, that looks just like the one we just saw. With a fluid layout, you can make this as your browser window expands or contracts, you can change this. When you are using a fluid layout, virtually 100% of the time, you are working with percentages here. So you want to say that this should take up 70% of the screen, for example. What we'll get to in Chapter 8, when we talk responsive, is we'll say when you go and you reach a certain pixel point, as far as how wide your browser is, then we'll change this. We'll do stacking, where you'll have your header, then your main, then you'll have your aside, then you'll have your footer. That's what we'll get to. Because again, that's typically what you see on a site for a phone. In fact, when it gets narrow enough, the header won't even show. Maybe you've seen that where instead of a header, you've got this. That thing. It's typically referred to as a hamburger menu. All right? And you click on it, and that brings up, your menu or whatever you might have in the header. That's what we're moving toward soon. So again, they showed you the fluid. The difference is 90 pixels, 66 pixels, 33 pixels. All right? So you're doing the same thing both times. Now, when you start talking about 3 columns, notice how it changes. In many ways, this is much more reminiscent of a newspaper. I know when I say newspaper, sometimes people look at me, what the hell is a newspaper? All right? But if you still get a paper copy of a newspaper, many of them are set up like this. And notice again, here they're showing it fixed with pixels, but you can do that, and you can also do that. That's a little harder to do with 3 columns, but you can do that also fluid. All right? So it says 2 web pages that use a 2-column fixed layout. So first they've got a home page, and that's what it looks like. Now, do you have to make that another color? Of course not. But a lot of times you will use a different background color either here so that the aside stands out. All right? And if you've never heard this term before, if this is an aside, the idea with an aside is that's something that's known as being tangential. In other words, it's not something that you really need on the page. The page would suffice just fine without it, but you put it on there because it augments or it adds something to the page. And I've given you the example before. If you've seen all the problems that they're having in California with the wildfires right now, for example. And let's just say they had a whole page dedicated to the wildfire right here. And then over here, they have something about somebody who saved a dog. You know, that has really, you know, you could have this thing about the wildfire without knowing about the dog, but the aside is just something to break up what's on the page. That's all. Yes. Pardon? You can. All right. Again, typically what's in vogue today is to put them up on the top, but yes, you can do that. And if you're going to do that, quite often, that would be if you had a 3-column. All right, you'd have the navs way over on the left here. Yeah, so yes, you can do that. You know, and it's, I can't really say, you know, you can, but you shouldn't. Because you never know what somebody, if you're doing work for somebody else, you never know exactly what they want. And again, you may not agree with it, but if they're paying you, paying you good bucks, all right, you want that ugly purple color? Okay, I'm putting it in there. You know, you want that stuff there? Okay, I'm putting it in there. So as it says, this illustrates a common page layout with a header, 2 columns, and a footer. And again, I don't want to sit and read this to you. All right? And then they give you the HTML for the home page. There's nothing that's in here that we haven't done, except now they are putting an aside in. All right, that's why I had you add that section last time, so that we can actually put it on one or more pages on the site. All right, and I will tell you, for example, the home page on the Leave Me at Home, you may or may not have noticed this, it's really bland right now because it's all text. So if we did put an aside there, all right, that probably would at least make it look a little bit more inviting. What I'd like us to get to eventually, when we get to the JavaScript and then the Bootstrap stuff, is on the main page at the top, we're going to have a carousel. So hopefully he'll give me pictures of 50 of the dogs he walks, and they'll just be going across the screen. All right. So on all of these, they give you the HTML, then they give you the CSS. All right. Then there's a second page. This is the speaker page. All right. Now maybe this is more of what the Leave Me at Home should look like. And what I mean is, he's got to send me a better copy of his thing for the logo. But if we put the logo there, we put something like that here. This might be Leave Me at Home or whatever. And so that could be that. This is if he's got a tagline, we could put it there. All right. Until we get into talking about things like slideshows, we could put a picture here. All right. The reason that, just so you know, originally that picture of him and his dog Lily, I had that on the homepage. But the reason I moved it is that's what the site is about. That's why I moved it to the About page. Because that's where he had his intro letter where he explained, if you read that, why he created his business to begin with. All right. So you see that. You see the aside here. You can make your own judgment. You could turn around, for example, and say, this would have looked a lot nicer if this maybe was maybe even a cream or a light blue, and this was maybe a different color. Yeah, those are the kinds of decisions either a designer will make or a designer will make in conjunction with whomever she or he are doing the web page for. I mean, Rankin, if you ever noticed, red and white, if you've ever gone through it, it's a hell of a lot of red and white. And they give you the HTML, and they give you the CSS that they're using on here. All right. Okay. How to use CSS3 to create text columns. As it says, This figure summarizes the property for creating text columns. All right. What's cool about this is all the stuff you can do with column. As I mentioned to you before, if you're like, well, I'm not going to remember that or whatever, you go to W3 Schools, just put in columns, space CSS. I can virtually guarantee you that the first one or the second one that's going to come up is going to be the W3 Schools page for this. So if you don't like the explanations that are given here, you can go out there and get it. Notice how easy this is. Column count 3. The gap between columns. All right, rules, etc. So notice column count 3. The gap between columns. And do you want anything there? All right. I will tell you, because again, this is the recommendation. I used to always think, because I'm very anal in a lot of the ways I do things, that this text here and this text here and this text here should all be justified. You don't do that. You always leave those left justified. When you leave them justified, what ends up happening, unless you're really, really lucky, is you end up getting a lot of white space in between, in certain sentences, and that makes the page harder to read. So the recommendation is that you keep it left justified like this. So it says, as of this writing, Firefox does not support column span. But if we go out to all right, we come in here, we put in column, and we look down here. I don't see anything missing under Firefox. So again, this book is not that old either. Maybe it's a year old. All right, so you can see what happens. I think I mentioned this to you at the beginning of the semester. On the off chance I did not. What the W3 Schools does is they make recommendations. They don't make laws. They can't make something and make browsers do it. And that was the problem, was in the past, they would make these recommendations and Microsoft would flip them the bird and do whatever the hell they wanted to do. That's basically what happened. All right? But now virtually every browser that's around follows their recommendations. All right? And then you've got a lot more standardized look and feel between different browsers. All right. Here's a 2-column page, as it says, with a 2-column article. Okay? So that would be your content, main content area. That would be your aside. And again, the author shows that. This right here, probably the key part of the chapter, starting on page 226, how to position elements. All right? It says to position elements on a page, you use the property shown in the first table. All right, the first property, position, determines how the positioning will be used. Notice by default, it's static, which means just, if there's room for it on the row I'm in, put it in there. Otherwise, move down to the next row. It's dictated by what you're trying to put there and how much room you have to put it. All right, more than anything else. It says the second value removes the element from the normal flow and it positions it based on the top, the bottom, the right, and the left properties you specify. When you use absolute positioning, it's positioned relative to the closest block to which it's positioned. You'll have to see it in just a minute. The third one, fixed, is like absolute. But rather than being positioned to a block, it's positioned to your window. When we get in and we start talking about Bootstrap, and it won't be that long, when we get in there, we will set up our nav bar so it's fixed. In other words, we'll want it on the top of the page all the time. So when you scroll up and down, it doesn't move. Doesn't matter how big your page is. Most people like that. The fourth one, as it says, causes an element to be positioned relative to its normal positioning. All right, and as it says, that's relative positioning. And there's one more thing. Okay, if I'm working on a web page, and let's say that on that web page, I come in there and I put some kind of a background image. So I've got an image here. All right, then somebody else comes in and they put in a paragraph right here. And paragraph will go right over that background image. That makes sense? All right. And then somebody else goes and they decide that in that paragraph, they want to put another image right there. What's going to happen? It depends on a lot of different factors. But if you want control over which thing is in the foreground, you use what's called the z-index. And the z, the higher the number, the more towards the foreground it goes, and the lower the number, the more towards the background it goes. So you've got some control over that by using z-index. You're like, well, what happens then if you use z-index to use the same number for everything? Then the z-index doesn't matter because it's the same number. All right, again, the way to figure out how to use this is to create a web page and play with it a little bit. So here are the properties that you can use. And here is the static, absolute, fixed, and relative. And again, W3 Schools has got good examples on this where they use text and they have you position it relatively, absolutely, fixed, etc. All right. So again, it's static by default. To change it as it says, you change the position property to static, absolute, fixed, or relative. If you don't want to change it, you can put in static, but since that's the default, I've never seen it in there. All right. Then they show you how to use absolute positioning. There's the HTML and the CSS. All right. It says the web page with absolute positioning in a browser. You may or may not have noticed it, but here, that looks different. First, they shorten it up. But it's where you want something to appear absolutely on a page. All right. Now, again, that can get real skewed when you're talking about using it on a phone or you're talking about using it on a tablet. Then they show you, as it says, there's a sidebar with fixed positioning. Notice what happens. What if I didn't want that? What if I wanted this to show? One way to do that would be to change the z-index on this. All right? That would look bad too. Okay? We haven't talked about it yet, but we're going to talk about something that's called overflow. And when you've got overflow, it's the old adage, you probably have heard this, of trying to shove 10 pounds worth into a 5-pound bag. And overflow is what happens with that extra stuff. Usually by default on a web page, when you've got overflow, if you haven't said anything, maybe you've seen this. It'll set up, what's the word I'm looking for? I can't remember the word. But it'll set up, over here, like this. All right, so it'll basically set up scroll bar. That's what I'm looking for. It'll set up scroll bars for you by default. All right. If you don't want that to happen, because most people don't, you say overflow hidden, which means just don't show it. So if there's any extra, don't show it. All right. And looks like that's it for the chapter. So when you come in here tomorrow, all right, when you come in here tomorrow, the first thing that we'll do is I will give you a test review for Chapter 5 and for Chapter 6. All right? And then the rest of the period will be lab. All right? Then Wednesday when you come in, the first thing we will do is we will take a written test on Chapter 5. Thursday, the first thing we'll do is take a written test on Chapter 6. I will let you know either tomorrow or first thing Wednesday, but probably tomorrow, whether we'll have a test Friday or whether we'll push that off and have the test on 5, 6, 7, and 8. All right? Questions? All right, and you've got about 20 minutes now if you want to get started on this.